Welcome everyone. All of us are already familiar with Keynesian economics. Now, today we are going to briefly discuss about the axioms of Keynesian economics. Then we will move on to a newer topic, relatively new topic, which is New Keynesian economics. And in New Keynesian economics, we are going to discuss about the menu cost model, which is also known as the sticky price model. Now, the three basic axioms which were mentioned in classical economics was first the axiom of neutral money, which means money cannot affect real outcome. Second, the axiom of ergodic economic world, which means that future can always be predicted. Number three, the axiom of gross substitution, which means that everything is a substitute for everything else. Now, all these axioms of classical school of thoughts, they were rejected by Keynes. According to Keynes, these axioms, they were not applicable in real life economy, in a real world situation. So, according to Keynesian economics, number one, money matters both in the long run and in the short run, which means that money is never neutral and it also affects the real life decision making, real production, consumption and employment situation. The second classical axiom, which was overthrown by Keynes, was that according to Keynes, in the economic system is moving towards a non-reliably predictable future. So the economic system is moving towards non-reliably predictable future. Also, according to Keynes, in laissez-faire economy or in a free market situation, full employment doesn't exist. So unemployment was normal, it was common, in market-oriented monetary production economy. Now we will see how Keynes explained the concept of effective demand and how classical economists, they were unable to do so. Now we can easily see this difference between classical economics, classical thought and Keynesian thoughts, because according to the classical economists, supply creates its own demand. Basically, they believed in Say's law. Now let us see with an example or a simple diagram. We know that a production process, it takes some amount of time. from inception to its completion. Now, what goes on between this inception and completion is that the owner of the firm, he must hire workers and he organize raw materials which can be used for the production process so that the output can be produced and finally sold to the consumer. Now, if I write the aggregate supply function, coming to the aggregate supply function first. Aggregate supply function, let us denote aggregate supply with Z. Aggregate supply is basically showing the relationship between expected sales of the entrepreneurs and the level of employment he is going to hire today. So expected sale of entrepreneur, this is the future sale, and level of employment, that is N, denoted by N, that he is going to hire today. This is a present situation. So the aggregate supply function is basically showing the relationship between expected sale, the sales of future of the entrepreneur, and the level of employment that he is going to hire today, that is his present employment. Now this aggregate supply function, this will be upward sloping, because as his expected sales increases, he is going to hire more and more labor, as he is expecting the sales to be higher in the future. He is going to hire more and more labor. That is why the relationship is positive. Expected sales in future and level of employment today in present, they have a positive relationship. That is why the aggregate supply function is upward sloping. Now coming to the aggregate demand function. Aggregate demand, which is denoted by D. This aggregate demand function, it is showing the relationship between consumers' expected or desired expenditure. So his desired expenditure at any given level of employment. So the aggregate demand function is showing the desired expenditure of the consumer at any given level of employment. Now, if we draw this aggregate demand function, as this demand function should be upward sloping, because as the employment rises, his spending will rise, because as the employment is rising, then the person is hiring, the person is earning more and more income, then he will be able to spend more and more money. So the aggregate demand function is upward sloping. Now coming to the basic difference between classical economics, where there is no effective demand, and Keynesian economics, where Keynes has introduced the concept of effective demand. We will start with classical. So aggregate supply, aggregate demand, both the Okay, now classical economists, they always believed in Say's law. They believed in the concept of Say's law, which means that supply creates its own demand. It means that as the farm, as the entrepreneur, he is producing more and more output. As the production of the output is increasing, demand for the output will increase at a same rate, which means that as aggregate supply, that is Z, is increasing, demand will increase at the same pace. So the same line, this is showing both the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Because in case of classical economy, supply is creating its own demand. Now suppose at any point of time we see that the actual level of actual employment level is NA and actual demand is at point G. Now suppose we are hiring more and more workers, so the employment amount is increased from NA to NB so that more output can be produced. We know that when additional output is produced, when there is more production, then supply of this output will create same amount of demand. So what will be the amount of demand? H. Earlier, G was the amount of demand and G was the supply and G was the demand. Now, as the employment level increases from NA to NB, demand also increases to point H. So, this is increasing the actual demand to point H and full employment level from NA to NB is actually established. So we can say that in Say's law world, which means in classical economy, there is no obstacle to full employment level. When there is expansion, when there is more supply, demand increases, there will always be full employment level. Now coming to the situation of Keynesian economy. Now coming to the Keynesian part or the part of effective demand. So initially the equilibrium level is when the supply is equal to demand, and here the employment level is NA1. This is not the full employment level, because at this point, although this is the equilibrium situation, at this point the entrepreneur he wants to hire more and more workers, because this is not the full employment level. He wants to hire more workers, just like previous situation. So he is hiring more worker, and employment level increases from NA1 to NB1 and it reaches the full employment level. At NA1, we can clearly see that aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. But just when the full employment level is achieved, we can clearly see that aggregate supply is more than aggregate demand. So there is insufficient amount of aggregate demand. Although there is production of commodities, the entrepreneur, he is producing the output, producing commodities, but there is insufficient amount of aggregate demand in the market. Earlier, as supply increased, demand also increased at the same place. So there, each of the point in classical economics, each of the point, it was Z is equal to D. So each of the point, it was effective demand. Each of the point was equilibrium level. But here there is only one equilibrium level, and at this equilibrium level we cannot achieve full employment. So this is called effective demand. E is called the effective demand because at E, aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. So when more products are brought to the market, it is found that aggregate demand is less than the sales. Now, what happened at this point is, when there is lack of effective demand, that sales is not achieved as they expected sales amount is not achieved, disappointing sales is there. So this will force the entrepreneur to recognize that the output produced by hiring the full employment level in B1, this cannot be profitably sold. So hiring in B1 amount of employment output cannot be profitably sold. As a result, entrepreneurs will reduce their hiring of workers until they reach from NB1 to NA1. So again they will reach from NB1 to NA1 at equilibrium level E, where there is some amount of unemployment. So NA1 is the amount of employment which is not the full employment level. Although it is equilibrium, aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand, there is some amount of unemployment at NA1. So this is the concept of effective demand, and in Keynesian economics, effective demand prevails in the equilibrium and some unemployment level prevails in the equilibrium, which was explained by Keynes, and it was overlooked by the classical economics. So basically, Keynes tried to show how the aggregate demand affects output and employment. Now, a key role is also played by the money wage rigidity, and also a fall in the aggregate commodity demand leads to a fall in labor demand, and as a result in fixed wage labor contracts and the workers' backward looking price expectation, the money wage will not fall sufficiently in the short run so that it can maintain the initial employment level. So employment and output will fall and unemployment as a result will rise. Now these are some of the properties of Keynesian economics which I have mentioned. Now let us move on to the new Keynesian economics. Now, two very famous new Keynesian economists that we already know are David Romer and someone whose book we have all read, N. Gregory Mankiw. Two of them are the popular new Keynesian economists. And after the Keynesian economics, there was this new classical economics, which challenged the Keynesian economics. And after new classical economists, there came new Keynesian economics, which with their own view, they tried to explain this new classical economists. Now, this new Keynesian model, there are three types of new Keynesian model. Now, one is sticky price or menu cost model. Efficiency wage models. And the last one is insider-outsider models. Now, some of the properties of this new Keynesian economics are they assumed imperfect competition in the product market, and earlier the Keynesian economics, they assumed perfect competition, whereas new Keynesian model, they assumed imperfect competition in the product market. Number 2, in Keynesian model, there was nominal rigidity, money wage rigidity, but in new Keynesian model, we see product price rigidity. Now, new Keynesian models, they also introduce the concept of real rigidities, factors that will make the real wage or firm's relative price rigid in the face of changes in aggregate demand. Now we are going to start with the menu cost model. When we are learning menu cost model or the sticky price model in new Keynesian economics, one important assumption that we are taking is that imperfect competition prevails in the market. Simply because we know that in the case of perfectly competitive market, the market price is basically determined by demand and supply condition in the market. Now, all the individual firms in the perfectly competitive market, they cannot control the price of the product. That's why they are facing a horizontal demand curve in a perfectly competitive market. So they don't have any control over the price of the product, and the price is exogenously given. And if any particular firm, it changes the price of the product, then it will lose its entire customer base, because since it's a perfectly competitive market, price for all the firms is same. If one firm charges higher price, then all the customers, they will shift to other firms. They will purchase the same product from other firms, because in a perfectly competitive market, all the firms are selling homogeneous product. So this is one of the assumptions, that there is imperfect competition prevails in the market. Now that imperfect competition is there, like it can be monopolistic competition, oligopolistic market, or monopoly, the product price, it can be controlled by the firm. So basically, even if the firm is lowering or increasing the price of the product, although the demand for its product will fall, but it will not lose its entire customer base. So that is the difference. And if there is fall in the demand of that certain product, and in that case, even if the imperfectly competitive market, in the imperfectly competitive market, the firms do not lower price, they will lose some customers but not all the customers. But still, when there is a fall in demand, the profit maximizing price, it falls even for a firm which is there in the imperfect competition, because when the demand for the product is falling, even if gain from lowering the price is very low, the profit from lowering the price, gain in the profit from lowering the price is very low, there will be some gain. Okay, now coming to the menu cost. What is menu cost? There will be some firm who will not lower their price even if the demand for the product is falling. Why? Because lowering the price and keeping the price constant. So, cost of lowering the price might be more than keeping the gain for the cost of lowering the price will be more than the cost of keeping the price constant. So, there will be some firms for whom the price will be constant even if there is a fall in demand. Then what is menu cost? Cost of price change is called menu cost. That is cost of lowering the price, or the cost of price change is called menu cost. So we have learned about menu cost. What is the definition of menu cost? Now there is a reason behind why it's called menu cost. This menu cost name, it comes from the fact that if a restaurant change the prices of the goods that prices of the food that they're serving, then they have to print new menus, and there is an added cost for that, which is called menu cost. So whenever they are changing the price of the food, then there will be an added cost. So the cost of changing price is known as menu cost. Now there are many types of cost. One type of menu cost is managerial cost. What is managerial cost? Whenever the firm is changing the price of the product, they have to inform their consumers about the change in price, or they have to communicate to their consumers that why they are changing the price of the product. And they might also have to negotiate with the consumers who are resisting or who are also against this price change. And they have to gather information regarding this optimal price change, which comes under managerial cost. Next is consumer goodwill. What is consumer goodwill? If a firm changes the price of the product, it reduces the price of the product, there will never be loss of consumer goodwill. But whenever there is a recession, demand for the price of the goods is falling, then and demand for the sorry whenever there is a recession and the demand for the good is falling, then if the firm it reduces the price of the product, then it also has to increase the price of the same product during the recovery period. And if it changes the price, if it increases the price during the recovery period, then there can be a loss of consumer goodwill. Now, if this costs of changing prices when the demand for the good is changing, good is falling, if the cost of changing prices is very high, then there will be price stickiness, which means that even if aggregate demand is falling, then the price of product remains rigid, because if there is a cost in the change in prices, because there is a cost in the change in prices, which are managerial cost and consumer goodwill. Thank you.